So nearby Brad, it's a Thursday evening. Let's crack open this beer and talk about violins. There's no more. There's no that gets me hyper for a beer than a good old chat about violins. Whoa. Oh, it missed the bin. Niccolò Paganini is widely considered one of the finest violin virtuosos in history, and his skill with the devil's instrument was such that many rumoured his skill came from Satan himself.
Robot devil? I get your hands? Zam!
Oh, what an appallingly ironic outcome! It's not ironic, it's just coincidental. Now fork over those lady fingers, Cookie.
Gossip that Paganini didn't exactly help assuage when he'd do things like walk on stage and shred on the violin with such ferocity that other lesser violinists simply gave up. So do you know anything about Niccolò Paganini, nearby Brad?
Is this the one who did the Devil's Trill?
No, that was Tartini. That was Giuseppe Tartini, who we talked about before. And if anyone wants Cliff Notes version of that story, Giuseppe Tartini was an Italian composer, I think, who one night when he was asleep was visited by the devil, or so he claims.
In air quotes.
Yeah, he claims he was visited by the devil, and the devil asked to play his violin, because Tartini often slept with a violin next to his bed, which is something common in a lot of musicians, I feel. I've read a lot of stories about musicians keeping instruments next to their bed. Like, for example, Freddie Mercury had like a keyboard in his headboard. So when he was asleep or half asleep, he could just like tinkle away on the ivories and like, compose new tunes. Or if he woke up with an idea, he could write it down straight away. Anyway, Tartini supposedly in this dream handed the devil his violin. The devil then proceeds to play a solo concerto of such like astonishing complexity that he immediately woke up. Like, it took Tartini's breath away, and then he woke up short-breathed, and then he hurriedly tried to transcribe what he'd heard. And the resulting piece of music, aptly titled The Devil's Trill, is considered one of the most difficult violin pieces ever composed. And according to Tartini himself, it was a mere shadow of what the devil actually played. But anyway, we're not talking about Tartini, we're talking about Paganini. So you're not familiar at all with his work or him as a person?
I feel like the name's familiar, so we may have discussed it briefly, but give me a recap.
Well, Niccolò Paganini, as mentioned in the intro, is widely considered one of the greatest violin virtuosos to have ever lived. And part of the reason why is that some of the stuff he could do on a violin is considered to be physically impossible, even with like modern techniques and instrumentation and the improvement in skill.
Wait, was Paganini the one who had the really long fingers?
Yes, he had extraordinarily long and flexible fingers. And for anyone out there wondering, well, what impossible things did these super long fingers let Paganini do? It's said that he could play 3 octaves across 4 strings, which would, in an ordinary person, require a hand span of 15 inches across.
Fun a bit.
Yeah, it's also larger than the largest hand span ever recorded. Which sounds like bullshit, right? Because he would need bigger hands than the person with the biggest hands in recorded human history.
Yeah, it sounds a bit too big.
So the theory is not that he had big hands, although he did have very big hands, but not the biggest ever seen in human history. He had Marfan syndrome. And are you at all familiar with Marfan syndrome?
Yes, because we've talked about Javier Botet before.
Yes, so Marfan syndrome, people aren't familiar, is a genetic condition which is characterised by the person having, amongst other things, abnormally long and flexible limbs. And you mentioned Javier Botet there. He is an actor who is like the guy in Wreck who plays the creature at the end, and that's how he's made his bread and butter.
My body is so aesthetic for horror creatures, and because of my flexibility, I can do a very weird movement.
Most recently, he was in The Last Voyage of the Demeter, playing Dracula.
And I bet he looks fucking terrifying as Dracula. Yeah, because he has almost inhuman proportions, because he's just so unnaturally tall and his limbs are so thin, but he also has an almost superhuman degree of flexibility in those extraordinarily long limbs. And in Paganini's case, it's believed he had Marfan syndrome, because it's said that he could play 3 octaves across 4 strings without moving his hand at all. Because that's the thing, a skilled violinist can do that, but they have to move their hand.
Yeah.
He could just do it, his little finger had enough flexibility in it to just go, whoop.
In my mind, his hand is just still on the neck, and the fingers are doing all the moving.
Basically, so you already say like a hand span like that. Like, he'd have to have an average hand span of 15 inches. He couldn't have that. But if his fingers went all the way down here, which they did, he wouldn't need to have like necessarily the largest hands ever recorded in history. You just need to have pretty big hands.
I'm really struggling not to picture him as salad fingers.
Well, I've got the picture here for the article. I just put E.T. In the original, I just put E.T. So, but yeah, that's like, he's rumoured to have had that because he's also described as being very tall, very thin, very flexible, evidently from his skill on the violin, but also very gaunt, which is another trait that people with Marfan syndrome often have. Although we can't say for sure whether or not he had Marfan syndrome, it's widely accepted that he did, because that would explain his appearance and the fact that he could do that crazy shit with the violin.
Did he only play the violin?
He played a couple of instruments like the mandolin, a few other stringed instruments, but he's most known for his skill on the violin.
Is there anything else he could do on the violin that would also be considered impossible?
Well, yes, because another thing that people with Marfan syndrome often display is double jointedness in many of their joints, and Paganini is presumed had that in his hands in every single part of his finger, because he could reportedly, like, just jut and angle and contort his fingers into like positions that would be painful, if not impossible, for an average person. And he used this combined with his unnatural flexibility and skill of the instrument to compose pieces that required you to like, jut and move your fingers around at speeds and angles which were just quite literally physically impossible for another person to do. And some of the pieces he composed are considered some of the most difficult for the instrument.
I have enough trouble doing bar chords. Like, just trying to bend your wrist around a guitar neck.
And that's the thing, he didn't, like, he could just do that, and keep in mind as well, he could play pieces that would require a lesser violinist to move their hand around the neck without moving at all.
Do you know if there's any music that he played that is literally impossible to play now?
Well, there's nothing that's impossible. There's some stuff that's regarded as difficult, and of course, like, skilled violinists can play the songs that he composed, but they cannot play them in the way that he would have. That's the key difference here. It reminds me a little bit of... you ever seen that breakdown of why all like classical music sounds like it sucks?
No.
Do you know when you listen to classical? What's your general image of like classical music? When you think, what tempo wise, what do you think of classical music? You think slow, right?
It's usually slower paced.
You think like Moonlight's like dun 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 dun.
Well, I mean, not as slow as Moonlight Sonata.
Well,
but
you think like slow, plodding, deliberate. It's like. Well, it turns out that a lot of famous compositions by people like Beethoven and Mozart were actually meant to be played a lot faster than they get played today, but orchestras, throughout time weren't as skilled as Mozart's orchestra or Mozart himself, so they would slow them down. And there's like videos out there, and presumably we'll have clips in if we can get them into the video without getting copyright struck, of like orchestras playing them at the speed that's intended, and they sound way better.
Somebody out there who's actually played in an orchestra before can probably correct me on this, but I would assume that the faster you get, the harder it is for everybody to stay on the same beat.
Of course, yeah, and then not to mention as well, like playing faster requires a higher level of skill. And if you've got an orchestra full of people, and if not everyone is at that level of skill, it's going to sound bad. So, and that's and that's reportedly what happened throughout history of a lot of famous concertos by Beethoven and Mozart, of just orchestras like across Europe and eventually the world simply couldn't play with enough skill to replicate exactly what Beethoven or Mozart or those other famous composers wanted, so just slowed down the tempo. And then they became like the definitive versions we associate with those pieces, even though that's not what Mozart and all that would have wanted. There's a really great breakdown I've seen of this where they're talking to experts on classical music of let's say we bring Mozart, Beethoven, Liszt, all these people to the modern day. What genre of music do you think they would like? What would they see as the evolution of what they created, not heavy metal?
Yeah.
I was like, why? Well, think heavy metal. So, an entire group of people all playing together at once.
Dubstep.
That's what they say, stuff like heavy metal, rock and roll, like blues, like anything that requires, an entire band. And they like it fast, they'd like it loud. And there's something similar that happened with Shakespeare. Have you ever seen this?
No.
Because people often think Shakespeare's dialogue sounds awkward and stilted and too flowery, and it doesn't flow right. And that turns out that because people aren't pronouncing the words correctly. And there are, again, hopefully we can put clips of this in there of plays and shows people have put on where they speak the dialogue as it was intended to be said. Because obviously these plays were written like hundreds of years ago. People didn't speak the way they do now. So they speak it with like the accent and the cadence that they would back then. And it makes way more sense and flows much better.
That his heels leashed in like hounds, should famine, sword and fire crouch for employment.
And at his heels, leashed in like hounds, should famine, sword and fire crouch for employment.
I have a huge appreciation for, you know, the works of Shakespeare, but it's a bit shit, isn't it?
Hey, if you like 10 things I hate about you, you like Shakespeare. Also, I think Shakespeare was the Michael Bay of his day. The thing is, people think Shakespeare high art now, don't you? You think Patrick Stewart or Ian McKellen on stage talking to a skull. It's like, that's not what Shakespeare was. Like, he put a lot of murders and sex and fart jokes and fanny jokes and stuff into his works because he knew that's what got bums on seats. And there were like evidence of communications he had with, like, you know, his rich patrons and stuff like, why do you put so much sex and violence in your plays? It's like, because it gets bums on seats. Like, he was the Michael Bay of his day. He was a crowd pleaser, but it's really weird. Now, the thing, like, you fast forward like 100 years, people might be watching like Michael Bay movies in that regard. You might think that's stupid. Well, we now do that with Steven Spielberg stuff. Like, Jaws turned 50 recently. People think of Jaws as this classic of cinema. When it was released, it literally helped invent the term popcorn flick.
I cannot see a future where the Transformers series are like performed on stage by people.
Think about Jaws. Like, you think of like classic cinema, you think of Jaws, and I said it helped invent the term popcorn flick. And do you know why? One of the rumored reasons why it got that name. The story goes that when they were watching previews of like the film, when like the first shark jump scare, all the people jumped and the popcorn flew up into the air, and that's what like came to like the popcorn. Just, you could see it rising, popcorn flick. Well, yeah, one of the first big summer blockbusters, which, like, you know, similarly paved the way for like all this mass entertainment, is now seen as a classic.
I mean, sure, but I don't view Jaws as high art in the same way that
but it's held
Shakespeare.
But it's held in very high regard. And if you fast forward 100 years, people will probably still remember Jaws, right?
Yeah.
You give it another 100 years after that, people are going to still remember it, presumably.
I want to see Jaws, but performed in Shakespearean dialogue, and the shark gets lines.
Well, that's the thing. Like, remember we talked about like that Alien play? Like those kids who put Alien on as a stage play, and it was really good. Like, Alien's like nearly 40 years old now. As I was saying, it's going to happen. Anyway, bring it back to Paganini.
Yes.
You know, as I said, he was very, very good. So good, in fact, that like people would go to his shows who knew how to play the instrument and would just give up. Like, they just, like I said, just give up. Like, they go in, see Paganini play, like, have that moment of existential dread of, I will never be this good, and just quit.
If you can't accept that there's someone out there who's always going to be better than you, then you've no right to do anything, really.
But there's someone being better than you, and then there's someone doing things on the instrument you literally did not think were possible. And that's what happened. There's a story that's quite similar about Michelangelo.
Yeah.
When Michelangelo was like just, I think, like a teenager, he was like many budding artists would like go with another old master and, like, you know, do the shit they didn't want to do. Like, you're like, okay, paint those flowers, paint those cherubs. I'll do the big fresco. Like, you do the little shit in the bottom I don't care about. And the story goes that like Michelangelo painted like a cherub or something so detailed that the artist snapped his brushes in half and left. Because they just saw how good Michelangelo was and that he was already better than they were. Then you have, like, you know, the world realm of music. I don't know if it's Mozart or Beethoven. Was a famous story about when they were in a musical duel, which was a thing back then, which sounds awesome, where like virtuosos would play a piece and then the person had to do something better. So basically, like, you know, the precursor to the guitar duel.
Yeah.
And the story goes that, like, I forget if it's Mozart or Beethoven. There'll be a fact bar below clarifying which one it was. But the story goes that, like, the opponent played a piece of, like, you know, remarkable complexity. Like, you know, did like showing off like an absolute badass. And then, you know, went over, picked up their sheet, looked at it, turned it upside down, played the piece backwards. while flourishing and improving upon it. And the person before that even finished playing left and never came back to that city.
Rough.
And all I can think of now is that bit in Zoolander. Do you know, they're having like the walk off on stage and just the guy, I've got to go full monk. I've got to do it. He just pulls his underwear off right anyone else seeing.
What do you reckon's your favourite non-fighting duel in a film or TV show?
Ooh.
Two characters have a battle, but then it's not a battle of like fighting. It's a battle of something else.
I'm a big fan of like the Scott Pilgrim band versus band, when they have amp versus amp. And I kind of wish that scene went on a bit longer. Because I love that idea of amp versus amp and then the bass battle.
Yeah.
I was really hoping that would go on a bit longer as well.
I'm going for American Pie 3, American Wedding. Stifler on the dance off.
Oh, yeah, the proper dance on the floor.
Such a good scene.
Bring it back, though, quickly to Paganini. And in addition to, like, you know, just causing other people to straight up quit, he was also so good at playing the violin, people didn't want to touch his violins.
They didn't want to touch his violin.
Yeah, so the story goes that, and I have the name here, that Paganini, he owned a violin by a level 80 violin smith or luthier, created by a guy called Giuseppe Giuneri.
Level 80?
It's a joke. I'm just saying, he was a level 80 violin smith.
I thought that violin makers had like a level system.
No, he was up there. He's like, you know, like Stradivari. People, you know, he was like a violin of that quality.
Okay.
And a wealthy patron of Paganini's was like bought him one of these like violins and like, well, who else to play it but you? And the story goes that Paganini played it, the patron saw, and then like when Paganini offered him it back, like, I'm not worthy to touch it. Just like, I am not worthy to even handle this instrument. It is yours. It belongs to you.
I can never make as beautiful a music as you can with this instrument.
Like, they straight up said, it belongs to you now.
Man, I love instruments that like a bit banged up tell a story. Like you get it often with like country singers when they travel around and the instrument gets a little bit banged up, it gets stickers on it, it gets a bit.
Well,
of,
it was the Frankenstrat. You familiar with the Frankenstrat?
No.
That's the guitar that Brian May plays. The Frankenstrat is basically him and his dad made it, and it's just cobbled together from like an old Stratocaster and then a bunch of other bullshit, and that's his prime specialty. It's what he learned to play guitar on. And it's the Frankenstrat. You have the Hitmaker. You familiar with the Hitmaker?
No.
That's Nile Rodgers. People don't know Nile Rodgers. Like, you're probably most famous from the Get Lucky video. He's the guitarist in that, but he also did the guitar work on Halo 2. But yeah, his guitar, he calls it the Hitmaker because he's like a session musician who's played for a bunch of people. And I just love the idea of an instrument being so good it has a name. And do you know what Paganini's violin of choice was called?
Oh, come on, I'm going to think of it. Give me a clue.
I'll give you a clue. It's because of the thundering noise it was able to make in his hands.
The Storm.
The Cannon.
Ooh.
The Cannon! Oh. And I think it's still on display, and then every now and again, someone has to get out and play it, because violins have to be played, otherwise they degrade. And there's just like one person who every now and again gets to play Paganini's violin.
Is that something to do with the vibrations?
It's just that thing of like, you know, it's also that thing of like, it's an instrument, it deserves to be played.
Oh, it's a myth, like it'll lose its power.
Which is that thing, it's like, it's a shame to put something like that behind glass and it never, like, you know, play music again.
Whenever we go to the video game museum, I always walk around and see those ones behind glass, like, you could be playing...
It's the shame that it doesn't get to be played. And speaking of, like, violins, there are always other violinists watching Paganini play, destroying their violins and just quitting forever. Like, not just quitting, but destroying their violin. It's like, well, I'll never make music like him.
That, to me, makes it sound like they didn't really enjoy playing the violin. Like, their parents made them play it, and they did it as, like, a session musician or something.
Yeah, but, like, you know, we've not talked about one of the most hilarious things about Paganini, and that's the fact that people thought he got his playing skills from the devil. So this is a pretty common trope. We talked about like Robert Johnson before, haven't we?
Yeah.
The guitarist who was so good that people thought he was two guitarists because he could play so fast. Paganini had a similar story where his level of skill was such that people thought, well, how did he get so good? He's so good, like, you know, like it must be from the devil.
Why couldn't it be from God?
Yeah, that's the thing. Well, it's called the devil's instrument.
The violin.
The violin is the devil's instrument. And in defense of the people who thought Paganini was some sort of demon, he didn't exactly do much to try and, like, you know, dissuade people from believing this, because he actually kind of liked, like, you know, the notoriety, people thinking he had magic powers and was like a devil man and a demon brought. So he would roll up to his concerts in a black carriage drawn by black stallions, wearing all black, including like long tails. And then when he got on stage, he had long black hair as well, and he would play and he would dance around. So, like, you know, the descriptor is he looked like a giant bat.
So Aussie, basically.
Yeah, and people would faint in the front row, and the people ascribed that to his magical powers. And you mentioned Ozzy there, and like there are so many direct parallels between these like classical musicians and, like, you know, modern rock stars. Like he was like basically like Ozzy Osbourne on stage, all black, You know, he was just like, you know, goth. He was goth chic.
What era did you say this was?
Like 16th century, I think.
So it's not a time where he's literally going to get grabbed and killed for being the devil.
No,
Yeah.
people just like assume that something was amiss because nobody's that good. And one of the best things about this rumour is that it actually ended up creating like this awesome legacy for Paganini. 'Cause after he died, the rumours of him being like some sort of demon were so prevalent they refused to allow his body to be buried in a churchyard. So there was like a couple of like months, I think, where his body could not be buried on a church ground, which only served to like, you know, further his legacy.
Oh, because the rumours go around where they're like, oh, we tried to bring it onto the churchyard and it couldn't get
Yeah,
over the
that's the thing, like, you know,
threshold.
the telephone game of history made it sound more and more intense. But I just love the idea that this guy, he was just that good. And he was that good. And people thought he had demon powers. Fuck yeah.